I'm Mark Trexler with the Climatographers. Why explore whether societal and business decision makers might be underestimating climate risks? Hasn't the business community been talking about climate risk nonstop for the last couple of years? Maybe, but if climate risk is being underestimated, all the risk management efforts being undertaken might do little to actually mitigate climate risks. And there is lots of evidence to suggest that from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change on down, most climate risk assessments today are downplaying or entirely missing potentially important sources of climate risk. That's why I'm making this video. Let me provide you with some insight into where I'm coming from on this topic. I originally started working in the energy field and helped site one of the first utility-scale solar power plants in California, as well as the only coal-fired power plant ever approved by the California Energy Commission. After graduate school, I joined the World Resources Institute to work on climate change mitigation, which led to my work with the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. I founded the first U.S. consultancy specializing in business climate strategy and risk management, Trexler Climate and Energy Services, and later became Director of Climate Risk at Oslo-based Det Norske Veritas, or DNV. While at DNV, I co-authored the first business climate risk textbook for use by the London School of Economics. Even then, however, it was clear that the topic of climate change risk would outstrip my ability to produce and update the textbook. And that led me to start building the Climate Web as a business decision support system. The Climate Web has come a long way since then, and today is the closest thing to a collective business intelligence for tackling climate change. The Climate Web can help you implement the universal business advice of test your assumptions, which is particularly important for a topic as dynamic and fast-changing as climate change. Here's why I say that. Risk equals consequence times probability, and I visualize the climate consequences probability distribution here. Don't get too hung up on its precise shape. What's important is that the distribution can be split into two parts. The first I'll call expected risk. The second I'll call long tail or fat tail risk. The first category tends to encompass higher probability, lower consequence outcomes. The latter, just the opposite. It's also important to remember that risk is closely linked to uncertainty. The more uncertainty about the future, the more business risk. And when it comes to climate change, there are lots of uncertainties. Yet we tend to focus much more on expected risk than long-tailed risk. One commonly cited explanation for that is that scientists don't want to be alarmist and end up erring on the side of least drama. Another is that we suffer from a failure of imagination, and that we're more comfortable focusing on the better understood and quantifiable, but less risky, aspects of climate change. Another source of potential risk is that we may be wrong about some fundamental ways climate change will happen, including the sensitivity of the climate system. We also celebrate the fact that current climate models do a good job of recreating past instances of climate change. Bear in mind, however, that prior instances of climate change occurred over thousands of years, not decades. That's a big source of uncertainty in its own right when it comes to today's climate forecasts. What if the temperature equilibrium associated with a doubling of GHGs in the atmosphere is 4 degrees C rather than closer to 2? The risk implications are enormous. It's useful to recall Donald Rumsfeld's famous quote, which is hugely relevant in the context of climate change risk assessment. A couple more pieces of the climate risk puzzle. First, the fact that the probability distribution of climate outcomes is shifting doesn't make risk assessment any easier. Scientist James Hansen concluded some time ago that the probability distribution of temperature anomalies in summer months has already shifted to the right by about 1 standard deviation over several decades. Now, a 1 standard deviation move to the right might not seem like much, but here's what that means in the context of a normal probability distribution. Yes, our long tail distribution isn't a normal distribution, but the basic principle that infrequent events will become commonplace and that very infrequent events will become less so is just as true. Also problematic is that climate tipping points, largely ignored in climate models, are becoming more likely to tip over time, creating uncertainty and therefore risk. The last puzzle piece I'll mention without a lot of discussion is systemic climate risk. The systemic climate risk conversation is very new, but systemic risk may well be the risk elephant in the business decision-making room. Let me try and pull a lot of these ideas together. First, most climate risk conversations today are focused on global temperatures and relatively modest levels of change in those temperatures. Effectively encompassing climate risk, however, requires a much broader view, including that we could be in for much more temperature change than we generally assume. Then there are physical impacts, including ocean acidification, species extinctions, potentially rapid sea level rise, and a slowing Atlantic current. Some of these may seem obvious today, but it's worth remembering that a large consulting consortium told business decision makers as recently as 2011 that potentially material physical impacts of climate change were still decades away. Then there's disease migration and supply chain disruptions, regional conflicts, and environmental migrants. Climate change tipping points, food shortages, and systemic risk-driven economic instability, political instability, and even the possibility of global conflict. And of course, any business risk assessment should address potentially material and consumer responses to worsening climate change. I'm not trying to predict the future, and I'm not saying that all or most of these outcomes will come to pass in business relevant timeframes. I'm therefore not suggesting that all of these outcomes are relevant to all business decision making. But I am suggesting that if these and other variables are being downplayed in or are missing altogether from risk assessments, a lot of climate risk might be unaccounted for. So how can you test your climate risk assumptions? I mentioned the climate web at the beginning of this video, and I'll introduce you to it very briefly now. Here's one spot in the climate web where you can access all kinds of information to help you explore climate risk topics. Anyone can access this information in the climate web, or the climatographers can help. To help you dig deeper into this topic, we've created a very simple website at underestimatedrisk.climatesites.net. Take a look. We'd welcome your feedback and questions.